Have you ever felt a fear so strong it seemed to seep into the walls, like the house itself was alive with your terror? That was my childhood. My name is Leah, and I'm 22 now, but it took me years to understand just how deeply fear had shaped my life. I grew up in a place where screams and silence carried the same weight. My father's rage was as steady as the ticking of a clock, and I never knew which second would bring the next storm. The older I got, the less I believed things would ever improve. My father's abuse didn't stop. My mother still drifted through each day like a ghost. At 15, I decided I couldn't go on. My father had pounded his fists into my ribs with a cold fury, sneering that he hated me and had thought about killing me. I lay in bed, bruised and hopeless, whispering a final prayer. God, please just let me die. Suddenly, a piercing pain erupted at the base of my skull, like my head was being split in two. Then the pain disappeared, and so did everything else. My bed, my house, the very world. I was floating in utter darkness, not frightened at first. It felt restful, even calm. But then it hit me. I was still aware, still thinking. This was death, yet somehow I was conscious. Panic surged. Was I trapped in some cosmic void? That's when an overwhelming presence surrounded me. It wasn't a person or a shape. It was a force as infinite as the darkness, but radiating with love, as though it had been there all along, waiting. I felt this presence fill me with a deep understanding. I had never been alone, not even in my worst moments. I wanted to stay in that love forever, but a shift occurred. Suddenly, I was in a vast cavern lit by a soft, pulsing glow. The walls glistened with strange patterns. I pressed myself against a rocky edge, feeling like I shouldn't be there. A figure appeared, tall and ethereal, her form shimmering like an aurora. She was humanoid but not human, elongated head, large dark eyes that seemed to reflect galaxies. I felt her speak inside my mind. Are you going to stop hiding? Her voice carried equal parts curiosity and caution. Even though she looked so different from anything on Earth, I felt no fear. I noticed a massive glowing screen on the cavern wall behind her. It showed scenes from my life, moments I'd lived, some forgotten, some too painful to remember. Why do you keep showing me my own life? I asked her silently. I know what happened. I want to understand you. She offered no direct reply, just turned her gaze back to the screen. Then the images shifted to a scene of me at a school musical standing center stage. I remembered that night clearly. I was the lead in the show, with no understudy. If I died, the production would fall apart, and it would hurt all the people who had worked so hard. I'd convinced myself no one would notice if I vanished, but here was evidence that I mattered more than I realized. As soon as I accepted that fact, the cavern dissolved. It was like a rope caught me around the chest and yanked me backward through infinite space. Then bam! I crashed into my body. My stomach lurched, and I threw up from the shock. My heart hammered and my head throbbed, but I was alive. That night, I fell asleep, wondering if everything that happened was real, or if I'd finally lost my mind. I woke up the next day with bruises still on my skin, but something new in my heart. The despair that used to swallow me felt quieter. My father was still himself, but I saw him differently, a damaged man drowning in his own misery. I didn't excuse his behavior, but for the first time, I realized he wasn't just a monster. He was a human being who didn't know how to love. That's when I remembered the unconditional warmth I felt during those near-death experiences. If that love had embraced me at my worst, maybe I could offer a piece of it to him. I certainly couldn't bring myself to say, I love you out loud, but I decided to focus on one small aspect of him I could appreciate, his gardening. Oddly enough, my father always put genuine care into our yard, planting roses, fruit trees, and rows of flowers. Even when he was at his angriest, he'd step outside to nurture living things. That felt like a clue, a bit of goodness in him I could latch onto. From then on, whenever he yelled, I tried to shift my thoughts. I mentally repeated, "You're a good gardener. You have that spark in you," over and over, imagining a soft, calming light flowing toward him. I did this silently. I never dared voice it. At first, nothing changed. He still shouted and threw things. But after weeks turned into months, I noticed tiny breaks in his anger. Sometimes he'd raise his hand as if to strike me, but lower it uncertainly. His rage no longer seemed as certain, as if something inside him was loosening. Then one day, after a particularly tense outburst, he just looked at me and said, "You're the only person in this world who cares if I live or die, aren't you?" His voice was strangely small, like a child's. He was wrong, of course. I didn't want him to suffer, but I certainly didn't think of myself as his savior. Yet in that moment, it felt like he had sensed the love I was sending him, even if I never spoke it aloud. I told only a few people about my near-death experiences. Predictably, some dismissed it as the product of trauma or an overactive imagination. My sister, Irene, who had survived her own ordeal, still couldn't fathom how I could forgive our father. She said I was just rationalizing everything, that it was Stockholm Syndrome or something similar. A few friends argued that near-death visions were purely neurological phenomena, the brain firing random images under extreme stress. Maybe they were right in part, but none of those explanations captured the incredible sense of love, purpose, and perspective I'd gained. I don't claim to have the final truth, but I do know that love is more powerful than most of us realize. People who lash out and hurt others are often the ones hurting the deepest themselves. If there's a divine presence or universal force or something greater than us, I believe it is made of pure love. That's what I encountered. That's what I used to slowly, cautiously change the emotional climate in my house. These days, my father and I have a fragile truce. He's nowhere near the man I wish he could be, but he's no longer the monster who tormented my childhood. He's expressed regret in small, stumbling words, though I'm not sure if he fully grasps the damage he inflicted. My mother remains distant, living with the weight of choices she didn't make. Sometimes she looks at me with tears in her eyes, as if she wants to say something but can't form the words. Irene still struggles to forgive him, and I respect her journey. Healing isn't a straight line, and we all cope in different ways. If there's one thing I've learned from drifting close to death 3 times, it's that nobody is truly alone. Even in the darkest pit of suffering, there's a love so profound that it transcends anything we experience in ordinary life. When you feel unlovable or invisible, remember this: you matter. You matter to the people who would feel your absence if you were gone. You matter to a universe capable of surrounding you with a love so intense, words can't describe it. That knowledge guided me, giving me a reason to fight on, even when everything seemed hopeless. So that's my story. A child who lived every day in terror, who caught glimpses of something beyond human understanding, and who came back with a heart determined to love, even the one person who'd hurt me most. I won't tell you I have all the answers, but I will tell you that you are far from alone. Whether you call it God, the universe, or just the human capacity for compassion, love is real. It changes us. And it saved me, one near-death moment at a time.